Hi, Chris Peaks here, back with Lucas Wilder tonight. Been a while since we chatted. How you been, man?
I've been better in some ways, but I'm getting better. So that's always a good thing.
Always beats the alternatives. So we're gonna have a chat here tonight on one of the whipping boys of the Gettysburg battle. See if it's myth or fact. General Ewell, man. What about him? Was it he the whipping boy? He to blame? I've heard both sides. He did a great job on day one, and just let's start with there. Leading in there. What takes place?
Well, I believe you're exactly right. Richard Ewell has become the whipping boy for a lot of people that talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. And Richard Ewell, I think it's unfair that he gets that kind of reputation because people put Jackson up on a pedestal, and I'm not the biggest Jackson fan, other than his Valley campaign, which did strain the Army quite a bit, or his Army, that is. Uh, the rest of his military career is, at best, it's about average. But people had put Jackson on a pedestal even at that time. And so when Richard Ewell takes over of the Second Corps, he seems to have big shoes to fill, but I think he more than fills them. I think he does a reasonable job, especially on this first campaign that he's going to be doing, which is the Gettysburg campaign. Richard Ewell, during the first day, he's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's north of the town of Gettysburg when A.P. Hill's Corps engages with Union forces outside the town, mostly Union cavalry until the First Corps come up. And as the First Corps is coming up, the 11th is right behind. Richard Ewell's coming down from Carlisle. Lee is trying to concentrate all of his forces around Gettysburg, because one reason he chooses Gettysburg is because there's so many roads there. It's like spokes of a wheel. There's about 10 roads that converge on that one town. So this is going to make it easier for him to concentrate his army so that he can defeat the Union Army when he needs to. But he's having to fight the Union Army for that town, but he needs the town. So Richard Ewell's coming down from the north as A.P. Hill is hitting the Union forces from the west. A.P. Ewell's forces do a great job of deploying. Robert Rhodes's division, he's got three divisions. Robert Rhodes's division, he's got Jubal Early's division, and he's got Edward Allegheny Johnson's division. All three good commanders from all respects. Richard Ewell comes down from the north. Robert Rhodes's division deploys right in front of Oak Ridge, and Robert Rhodes is actually on Oak Hill when he's seeing a lot of this going down. The Union forces are entrenched on Oak Ridge. Robert Rhodes's men, it's a bloody fight that Robert Rhodes's men are engaged in, but he's helping A.P. Hill push them off Oak Ridge and conversely Seminary Ridge, which run right next to run abut one another. And as he's doing that, Jubal Early's division starts coming down from the north, attacking what's now Barlow's Knoll. Barlow's Knoll is known because it was originally Blotcher's Knoll, but Francis Barlow, the boy general, gets so badly wounded there that they leave him for dead. But he recovers and he goes on to fight with the Second Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock and does wonderful service under him, one of the unsung generals of the Civil War. But Jubal Early is pounding the northern section of the Union line just north of Gettysburg at Barlow's Knoll. And this Union line seems to break almost simultaneously when Robert Rhodes and Pender's division under A.P. Hill attack Oak Ridge and Seminary Ridge and start pushing the Union forces through the town of Gettysburg. Jubal Early's division breaks the Union line, which is mostly made up of 11th Corps troops to the north. Once they bust through that line, when the Union forces start streaming back through the town, they're trying to find some place to gain some kind of foothold, some high ground for them to be able to defend themselves. This is where two men become very important. One of them is Winfield Scott Hancock, who arrives on the field and basically takes command, and another man on the field, which is Oliver Otis Howard. John Reynolds, who normally would have senior rank over many of these troops, is dead. He dies fairly early in the fighting. And so it's all Rodas Howard and Hancock. They kind of have a little bit of a squabble, and there's even some contention between the two. And there's some historical controversies over who actually, what went down at Cemetery Hill. And Cemetery Hill becomes a major point of contention when we talk about Richard Ewell. I know we haven't talked much about him yet, but I'm just setting up the whole process. So Richard Ewell has a decision to make. Do you attack Cemetery Hill? Because there's 2 Union Corps. They're not completely destroyed. I mean, they've been bloodied, but they're streaming back through the town. Hancock and Howard are placing artillery. They're placing these Union forces on top of Cemetery Hill. It's a very, very strong position. Do you attack it? And when Lee sends the message to Richard Ewell, take that hill if practicable. Now, what does that mean? Take it if practicable. Can you take it without losing a whole lot of men? He's already lost a lot of men. Robert Rhodes's division suffers heavily that first day. Jubal Early, even though he did a wonderful tactics against the 11th Corps at just north of the town, his men have been bloodied quite a bit. He's got a division coming up, but they still haven't. They're going to arrive a little bit later. So do you attack Cemetery Hill with 2 Union Corps convergent on that one location, and with your 2 divisions that are very bloodied? So that's the situation that Ewell is having to deal with on this first day at the Battle of Gettysburg. And here's Lee telling him, take the hill if practicable. He doesn't tell him to take it. He says, if it's practicable, which means what? Well, hopefully you won't lose a lot of men. And plus, if you don't successfully attack, they could counterattack. That's a possibility. If you attack and you lose a lot of your men, guess what? You're not going to have enough of a fight for the next couple of days. It's a big gamble. And Pender's division, as well as Heath's division, are bloodied as well. Can they come up and support you? It's getting dark. Do you want to launch a night attack? That's never really a great thing in the Civil War, to launch a night attack. There's not been a lot of success with those. Let's see Waxahachie with General Longstreet outside of Lookout Mountain. So General Ewell has a decision to make, and he makes the decision not to attack. And most people focus on that one moment in Ewell's career and say that was a huge mistake in the Battle of Gettysburg and in Ewell's military career. I don't think it's that big of a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake at all. I think trying to take Cemetery Hill on that first day would have been destructive to Richard Ewell's division, or Richard Ewell's divisions in his corps. And I point to Winfield Scott Hancock was asked after the war, could the Confederate forces have taken your position? He's asked this by a Confederate. And Winfield Scott Hancock says no. And I'm shortening it down, but he simply says no. He believed that he had such a strong position on Cemetery Hill, he could have thrown back any amount of soldiers that attacked it. Well, I won't say any, but you know what I mean. He would have attacked any Confederate assault. He could have probably thrown backwards. And I tend to agree with Winfield Scott Hancock. And a lot of people are question how many troops were actually on Cemetery Hill. That's up for historical debate. I'm going to go with Hancock and say that the hill was very well defended, and I doubt that Richard Ewell could have pushed them off the hill even if he had attacked, and if he had, he would have lost more men doing so. So that's the first day. Is there any questions you have so far?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I've always heard that there was one thing that I heard that Lee had gave this order at the end of the order, even to Harry Heath. We take that hill if practical, but avoid bringing on a general engagement. I mean, what does that mean too? I mean, avoid bringing on what is a general engagement? Just are we going to put some sharpshooters up there, or I never understood that full order.
That's a very, very good question, because try not to bring on a general engagement. That's essentially meaning for you not to. He's wanting to get his army concentrated. His army's spread out at this point. AP Hill is mostly on the field, all of his corps, and three or two of Richard Ewell's three divisions are on the field. But that's not his whole army. You got the whole First Corps under James Longstreet that is around Chambersburg, coming towards Cashtown. So he's not fully up and concentrated. He's wanting to wait until every man is with him before he makes an attack. That goes out the window. That, to avoid a general engagement, is an earlier order than what Richard Ewell's having to deal with at Cemetery Hill.
Okay.
Well, on the second day at Gettysburg, we have Richard Ewell, who is really assigned to he's controlling most of the Confederate left flank. AP Hill controls basically the town of Gettysburg, and going down Seminary Ridge, going down in a form, basically forming a fishhook around the Union fishhook, which the Union formed on from Culps Hill to Cemetery Hill and down Cemetery Ridge down to the round tops. Although they don't occupy the round tops just yet, they occupy the ground in front of it on the second day. And then the battle will result in them taking control of Little Round Top and eventually Big Round Top. So Richard Ewell is tasked with attacking Culps Hill and Cemetery Hill on the second day. Most of the action that happens in Richard Ewell's front happens at the end of the day. It's getting pretty close to dark. It's probably one of the most miraculous stories, and I wish someone would make a movie about simply the fight on Culps Hill that second day, because it is Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene. That's Revolutionary War. It's Brigadier General Greene of the 12th Corps in the Union Army. He performs an amazing defense of Culps Hill. I mean, it's amazing. Richard Ewell is throwing most of Edward Johnson's division at him, and with one brigade, Greene is able to hold off most of Richard Ewell's division. Richard Ewell's corps. I won't say most of his corps. Again, it's just one division, but it's still miraculous that one brigade is holding off an entire division. But that also tells us a whole lot about high ground, being able to be above the enemy and having the enemy having to attack uphill is very devastating. And plus, it's near dark. How are you going to be able to see? It's a miserable situation for Edward Johnson, but he performs it pretty well. I mean, these units are holding themselves together pretty good, even though it's a pretty monumental task. But Greene is holding on to Culps Hill. Richard Ewell's corps will get a foothold. It'll be Maryland Stewart's brigade that will gain a foothold just to the south. Let's see, be the east of Culps Hill in a little bitty swale. And so they'll get a little bit of a foothold there, and they'll hold it until the morning. And we'll get back to that here in a moment. So Culps Hill isn't taken. It's a very bloody fight, but George Greene of the 12th Corps, his single brigade basically, is able to hold on to Culps Hill. Now, it's the less talked about. Everybody talks about Culps Hill and on that second day, and on the second day, almost everybody focuses on Little Round Top, the wheat field, Devil's Den, the Valley of Death, the Peach Orchard, and even the attacks on Cemetery Ridge. But a lot of people don't talk about Cemetery Hill, and I featured this on one of my animated battle maps because I felt so strongly about it. It's a wonderful battle, or wonderful part of the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's basically Jubal Early's division of Ewell's corps. Again, Richard Ewell is tasked with attacking Culps Hill and Cemetery Hill, trying to take over these locations. It's near not attack when this goes down. Jubal Early throws in his division, and they actually capture part of Cemetery Hill. I mean, it's a costly fight, but he's able to capture part of Cemetery Hill. And one of the favorite little stories that occurs on Cemetery Hill is there's some Louisianians under Hayes, Harry Hayes, his brigade. These Louisianians come up. These are the famous Tigers. The brigade formerly is recognized as the Tigers. They attack Cemetery Hill, and one of these Louisiana men basically says, "I claim this cannon." And there's a German immigrant who's on this cannon crew, and he yells back in German, "You shall have it," after the Louisianian says that I claim this cannon. He pulls the lanyard, and the Louisiana soldier disappears in a red mist. I mean, just completely destroyed the man. Nothing, his friend said, nothing left of him. So that's how brutal this fight is. And it's Winfield Scott Hancock that sends additional troops to Cemetery Hill in order for it to stay in Union hands. It's so close. If there's any fault with Richard Ewell on this second day, it's that Robert Rhodes's division didn't deploy. They didn't go into combat on Cemetery Hill. They were supposed to hit Cemetery Hill from basically two sides. And Robert Rhodes does not go in. Whose fault is that? I mean, you got to ultimately put it with, Ewell. But Robert Rhodes didn't deploy. He was supposed to. But as a corps commander, you need to be able to know where your men are and if they're doing the job that you assign them to do. And so
well, why did they wait so late to go in? Because I've always heard that they was supposed to attack when they were supposed to go in at the sound of the guns.
Well, everybody is on this second day, even though Ewell does do some demonstrations towards Culps Hill earlier than that. Everybody's kind of waiting on Longstreet to some extent. Longstreet is supposed to attack earlier than he does. He doesn't get moving until about 3 or 4 o'clock. And that's when his attack launches. And so you've only got a couple hours of daylight left when he launches his attack. And so it's just a late day assault. And Culps Hill runs really late in the day. And if you've ever been to Culps Hill, you'll notice those hills create a lot of shadows. So when the sun's starting to go down, it's already starting to get dark, even if the sun isn't completely down yet. So it's it's going to be dark even at 3 or 4 o'clock. Not that it's going to be a dark, but it's going to be darker than it would normally be. So it's a fascinating part of the battle, but I love the battle for Cemetery Hill. But Robert Rhodes's division doesn't attack. Everybody, there's been historians that put forth ideas, but I don't know of anyone putting forth a great one of why Robert Rhodes decided not to attack when that was his, when it should have been what he did, and who knows what could have happened had they captured Cemetery Hill. I don't know if it would have been too big. Again, with Winfield Scott Hancock, he saves the Union on that day, on the second day especially, first day and second day. Because not only does he send troops to Cemetery Hill, it's his troops that are getting mauled in the wheat field and in Rose Woods and Stony Hill. So he's sending troops to both sides of the battlefield, opposite ends, to save the Union on that day. And so I can't talk about him nearly enough. But, so any questions about the second day at Gettysburg with Richard Ewell?
So they momentarily gained a foothold and then was thrown back off the hill?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
They gain a little foothold. They're able to grab a hold, but they aren't able to keep it. And so if you go to Cemetery Hill today, you'll notice there's 2 large statues, equestrian statues. One of them is Olive Rhodus Howard because of the first day's actions. And again, it was partially his troops that were there as well on Cemetery Hill. Actually, it was his troops there on Cemetery Hill, along with some others. And then we also have Winfield Scott Hancock. His equestrian statue is at Cemetery Hill. because of his actions there on those 2 days, which is the first and second day at Gettysburg.
Okay. No, you explained everything pretty good so far.
Good. It's the third day at Gettysburg that is it's the most misfortune for Ewell as far as his corps' ability to attack Culps Hill, because again, he's set to attack Culps Hill, and he's supposed to attack at dawn. When Lee wakes up, he's these dawn attacks. He's very much a fan of dawn attacks, as many generals were, and he hears fighting at Culps Hill. Well, Lee thinks, well, Richard Ewell's doing what I want him to do, and he listens toward Seminary Ridge into the south, but there's no gunfire coming from that sector. Longstreet is supposed to come up at dawn. Longstreet claims he never got the message, which that's contested as well. He probably, I think most people can agree, he probably did get the message. It's just him not wanting to actually launch the attack. Anyway, we're not talking about Longstreet, we're talking about Richard Ewell. And so Richard Ewell, that fighting that Lee hears early in the morning is actually Union troops pushing Richard Ewell off of that little foothold they gain at Culps Hill. So remember, they gained a foothold at Cemetery Hill, but they got pushed off. Maryland Stewart's troops did get a foothold at Culps Hill. But now it's not just Green's brigade, George Green's brigade. Now more 12th Corps troops are coming to Culps Hill. They've been moved there during the night and that morning. And so now Richard Ewell is not just having to deal with one brigade. Now he's having to deal with multiple brigades of men. The idea was for Longstreet to hit him in the center, as well as which would result in Pickett's charge, but it was also intended for Richard Ewell to attack Culps Hill, which he did. But there was just no hope for Richard Ewell to really take Culps Hill on that third day. He had a chance on the second, but again, terrain is the beast that you have to overcome, and it's very difficult to do so. So on that third day, Richard Ewell did everything he could. He threw Johnson's division up. They weren't able to take it, and they got pushed back, and they did lose the ground they did get. On the retreat out of Gettysburg and into Virginia, or out of Pennsylvania into Virginia, Richard Ewell performs good service. There's nothing wrong with his service. So I don't categorize Ewell as a failure in any way. He saw the situation for what it was. He did what he was told as a Corps commander should, and he made judgments that he thought the right judgments. I don't fault him any for what he did as a commander. So Richard Ewell becomes the whipping boy for a lot of people, because everybody says if Jackson had been there, he would have taken Cemetery Hill. I don't know if he could have taken Cemetery Hill. That's a big order, even for Jackson to have done.
Somebody pointed out something good to me the other day I never thought of. Jackson never would have been there anyway. He had his arm amputated. He'd been recovering from that.
Let's say even if he didn't get wounded and he was on that campaign, how do we know it would have been the same if it would have worked out the same exact way? It probably wouldn't have happened. But if we acquiesce and we give in to all these different scenarios and say that it worked out the exact same way, with only the difference being that Jackson was in command, I still don't think he could have taken Cemetery Hill. That's just my personal opinion, but hopefully I think some people agree. Of course, some people don't. That's all right. You can argue what you want to, but I don't think Winfield Scott Hancock would agree with you, and I'm betting with that man, because Hancock was probably one of the best Corps commanders out of any army of the Civil War. You just can't get much better than him, and I respect his opinion on that. If he says he could have held it, I'm going to side with him. But Richard Ewell,
if it was still divided in, if he had at least still had it as he planned, divided into 3 corps, and Jackson had lost a third of his troops he was commanding, then especially there's especially no way he could have taken it.
Mm-hmm. And you got to remember, people always forget logistics, and me and you talk about this all the time on the channel. That's why I like talking to you about these battles, is because you understand that when you're moving an army, you suffer casualties and you got to move. Many of your men are down, even if they're partially wounded, they're still incapacitated in some way. And then you're expecting them to march through this town, fight through the town, because there's still troops inside the town that you're having to fight through. Once you make it through the town, then you're going to have to attack uphill this very good position with troops streaming back through there constantly. Is that going to be a good situation for you? I don't think so. That's a lot to ask of your troops. Can you do it? I don't think it's possible. So
you got to communicate. You got to coordinate attack.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just, yeah. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying.
Yeah, I think people forget about logistics when they talk about the Civil War, and they're like, "Why didn't they do this? Well, why didn't they do that?" Well, the amount of men and animals that it takes to move an army is incredible. It's less so for brigades and divisions, but it's still a massive movement. And you can read any in-depth battle studies and realize that battle lines, just moving a battle line in a somewhat straight manner that you're supposed to move in, becomes difficult because the rolling terrain is going to make one side go a little bit faster than the other. If you're trying to swing them into a right wheel or left wheel, it's going to be a more difficult move if they're having to go uphill at it. I think people think you're just moving things around on a battlefield like a chessboard, but it's definitely not. Richard Ewell, I don't think and a lot of people criticize AP Hill, and AP Hill, this is his first campaign as a corps commander as well, just like Richard Ewell's. And I think they both perform reasonably well. Neither one of them, I don't think they did any horrible errors. There's errors, of course, like on any battlefield, but I don't think they were anything destructive. AP Hill, it should be the one that kind of gets criticized for bringing on a general engagement, because he does send 2 divisions for a reconnaissance mission, which is a little out of the ordinary. But I think it worked for the benefit, because there was already more troops on the field, and the first day was won by the Confederates. So in that respect, AP Hill was much better. His mistake was actually an advantage in that respect. But Richard Ewell was moving his troops very quickly.
Did Ewell become the whipping boy because of the book The Killer Angels, or had he already become the whipping boy before that?
It was already before that, because, like I said, it's just a few years later. Hancock is asked about that, so people's already asking questions, and people had Jackson up on a pedestal very early. He could do no wrong to most people, and it's even. I might be getting the time wrong. I'm thinking that it's during the Overland campaign where AP Hill is getting outpaced or outmaneuvered by Grant's troops, and Lee asked him, "Why didn't you do what Jackson would have done?" So even Lee is part of that, putting Jackson on a pedestal, which I do not agree with.
He drove those people back.
Mm-hmm. So it's. Ewell becomes that whipping boy pretty early. And then, of course, Longstreet becomes the bigger whipping boy when the Lost Cause comes around, and he gets faulted for a lot of things. But this happens a little bit more after the war. Ewell is the one that kind of gets thrown under the bus, as we say in the modern day, rather than the whipping boy pretty early on. But again, Longstreet takes a lot of brunt of that. I think it got the heat off of Richard Ewell when Longstreet becomes the target of most people. So they forget about Culps Hill, just like even the movie Gettysburg forgets about Culps Hill. So you don't even, if you watch the traditional version of Gettysburg, Richard Ewell's not even shown in the whole movie. So
yeah,
you have to get to the deleted scenes. So anyway, that's how Richard Ewell's thought of, at least in history, or maybe not thought of, I guess is the better way to put it, because he's not thought of that very often, and by the general public.
And I wish Culps Hill was more included in the history when they teach the Battle of Gettysburg, because it's such an important part of it that it's so overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Culps Hill, Cemetery Hill, and again, I emphasize Cemetery Hill personally just because I like the story of Hancock rushing to save. This is his second time that day he's thrown troops to save the Union Army, and he does so. But again, the Louisiana soldiers that again, it's not just Louisiana soldiers, but just that brigade going up there, man, those rough and tumble tigers of them going up to the top of the Cemetery Hill and capturing it for just a brief moment and then getting thrown back. But yeah, Robert Rose doesn't deploy, and he doesn't attack. He believes that I think one of his excuses is he was too late. After he had deployed his troops, he didn't launch his attack because he was too late. The men were already being pushed back, and it would have been just a bloody assault for nothing. But again, that goes back to Richard Ewell. That's an error on his part of not coordinating his divisions properly. But he did have a wide front, so I mean, you got to factor that in as well.
Right. Yeah, that was a wide front. Well, I guess all the questions I've got for you. Is there anything you wanted to add to it?
No, that's it from me. I've enjoyed the discussion because I like complicating the situation a little bit more when people think about Civil War battles. And again, never forget about logistics. It's always the constant factor for Civil War armies.
Well, good deal, man. Well, let's try to talk sooner and not waste much time. I don't know how 4 months got past us. The time just flies sometimes.
Things comes up. It's all right. We'll get back together again.
All right. We'll talk soon, man.
All right.
Bye-bye.